My name is Laurie Butler. I'm the Head of School for Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences here at the University of Reading. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the future of research in healthy eating, exercise and also brain training, looking as well at some of the evidence, trying to unpick some of the truth from the myth, and also trying to offer some ideas for where this research area is going to be going in the future. So one of the things I'm particularly excited by is the potential for looking at interventions, lifestyle interventions that combine exercise, nutrition and brain training all together.
So you've heard 3 talks on 3 different types of intervention. Okay? Now, the first thing I'd like to do is to get a sense of which intervention you would find easier to implement. Now, I'm aware that you're about as atypical of a normal audience as I can possibly imagine. You're a very, very healthy bunch. So, I'm going to ask you perhaps just to imagine for a moment that you're just an average member of the general population. Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 choices in a moment, and then we'll do a show of hands to see which intervention you'd find easier to do. So, would you find an online brain training task, say 15 minutes, 5 days a week, easier to do? Or would you find physical exercise, so perhaps cycling, 1 hour for 3 days a week? Or would you want to drink, say, a 500 milliliter flavonoid-rich drink every day? Or, for the superhuman of you all, would you do all 3? Okay, so, show of hands, brain training every day, 15 minutes. Ooh, a few of you. Sorry, Professor Kawashima. Moderate physical exercise. Yeah, so I reckon probably about half of you. The 500 milliliter flavonoid-rich drink option. It seems quite easy, but that's a lot of juice, I can assure you. And which ones of you would do all 3? Where are the diehards? Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's really good. I'm going to come back right at the end and say a little bit about how easy it is for some people, perhaps not so easy for others, to actually adopt some of these lifestyle interventions. Okay. Now, one of the reasons we wanted to have this workshop this evening was to kind of cut through some of the headlines, some of the slightly confusing messages that we all see in newspapers. This is a very newsworthy topic. So anything to do with exercise, anything to do with diet, anything to do with brain training is always very sort of media friendly. But there's a lot of often conflicting messages out there. So here's just a few messages from the nutrition literature. So, drinking juice, fruit and vegetable cuts Alzheimer's risk by 76%. Remember to eat your purples. Fruit can ward off Alzheimer's, heart problems and cancer. Should you be taking vitamin B to protect against Alzheimer's? B vitamins don't slow brain decline. Why these antioxidants could be causing you more harm than good. And finally, my absolute favourite, can beer make you smarter? Hop compound boost brain function, but you need to drink 3,500 pints a day. Now that I think is a challenge even to the most ardent camera fan. So there we go. So what we were hoping to do this evening was kind of give you a bit of a sense of sort of the state of the art of these 3 literatures, and certainly from what I've heard, I think we've hopefully managed to do that for you. But one of the things I wanted to make clear to you is that when you look at those headlines, one of the things you have to understand is that there is no magic bullet, okay? The factors that determine whether you're likely to show, on average, cognitive decline or not are multifactorial. There's lots of different factors that are involved in determining the likelihood of showing cognitive decline. So age, of course, is the single most important factor. As you age, you're more likely to show some element of cognitive decline, whether that be within a healthy range or whether that veers into perhaps a non-healthy range, such as MCI or dementia. But we also know that your IQ as a child is really important. It will explain about 50% of the variance in terms of your likelihood of going on to show some element of cognitive decline in later age. Education, really important. The more years of education you can build up earlier in life, the more protection you have as you start to age, statistically speaking, in terms of likelihood of cognitive decline. Karine mentioned cardiovascular function, as did Jeremy earlier on. We know that's an important factor. And genetic factors also perhaps not as important as some people might think, at least not at the moment. So there is one particular gene called ApoE, which we know, depending on the allele, particular variants you have of ApoE, can lead to a slightly elevated or slightly reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And also various socio-demographic variables we know are very important. So whether you come from a very affluent background or perhaps come from a more sort of impoverished background, we know that can have an effect as well. But of course, we also have the three factors that we're looking at this evening, which we know can hopefully reduce your risk on average of developing some form of cognitive decline as you age. So I'm going to be a little bit of a party pooper now, because one of the things I want to do is just try and draw together some of the findings I think that as researchers we need to learn. And I think for you guys, as people that read and are interested in these sorts of topics, also should be aware of when you read some of these press releases about some of the research that emerges from these types of studies. So firstly, one of the things as researchers we need to do better across the exercise, nutrition and brain training literatures is we need to run bigger and better studies. Many of the studies that you will come across, and some of the studies we presented this evening, are quite small studies. They're really well-controlled studies, but they are nonetheless quite small studies with quite small numbers of participants in those studies. If you want to say something about the general population, you need to run studies on a much, much bigger number of people than many studies currently run at the moment. And often that comes down to economics and also the practicalities of running these very big studies. We also need to have more appropriate control groups when we run these sorts of studies as well. So often in the brain training literature, what you'll find is that if you look at the detail, you run a brain training intervention against nothing. Okay, so no intervention, no control group at all. And that is really problematic because we know from 100 years of psychology that if you take a group of participants and you fuss over them and you make a big noise about them and sort of ask them how they are, just by doing that, you will improve their performance. They'll be more motivated and they'll try harder on tasks. So we have to get away from having interventions against nothing. Okay, so that's an area where we really need to improve the quality of the control groups we use in our experiments. And finally, one of the things that infuriates me as a researcher, but I'm just as guilty of it as other researchers, is we need to have much better agreement on the cognitive tests that we use across our studies. So we all use memory tests, we all use executive tests as well, and so on and so forth. But actually, if you look at individual studies, they very often will use very different tests from the next study. And that's really problematic, because when you want to compare across studies, it becomes very, very hard to do. So we're going to have to get a lot better at standardising our tests across different studies. Okay, so that's some of the methodological issues that I think you should be aware of when you look at those studies. But what are the sorts of questions that we might be looking at the future? So what sort of research direction should we be going in now that we've got to this point? One of the things you might have been thinking, and certainly something that occurs to me straight away, when you hear about exercise, nutrition, brain training, is what about combining these techniques? Okay, so rather than looking at these techniques in isolation, what happens if you start to combine a nutritional intervention with an exercise intervention? There's actually surprisingly little research out there at the moment, but we're just starting to work on a study with Professor Kawashima's group from Tohoku University, which is going to look at a dietary intervention on top of an exercise intervention. So seeing whether the effects of those two interventions alone can actually be additive. So are the effects combined better than one or more of those interventions alone? Another really big area where I think we need to do a lot more research is starting to understand whether there are particular groups of people that respond better to specific lifestyle interventions than others. At the moment, we have groups of participants that we put in control conditions, another group we put in an intervention condition, and in a sense, we're kind of looking at the overall effects on the group. But that doesn't take into account the individual differences that exist within those groups. Now, for example, there's a study by Wally et al. 2004, and what that shows is an association between omega-3 fatty acid intake and cognitive performance in older adults. And generally what it shows is that the more omega fatty acids you have in your diet, the better your cognitive outcomes. However, there is a subgroup within that study who have that particular variant of the ApoE gene, and they actually don't show that positive correlation at all. In fact, they show no correlation between omega-3 fatty acid intake and cognitive performance. So there may be subgroups within all of our studies that perhaps aren't responding well to those interventions, and we need to get much better at understanding who they are so that we can look for alternative interventions perhaps to deliver to them. Another really big question we have at the moment that we don't really have a very good answer to is how long-lived some of these lifestyle interventions on cognition actually are. So with Jeremy Spencer and with other colleagues present here in the room tonight, we're currently running a Research Council-funded study which is looking at a quite long-term supplementation of flavonoids on cognition. So we're running an intervention with older adults over 24 weeks, and then what we're doing is we're measuring cognition at the end of 24 weeks. We hope to show an improvement over that quite long supplementation period. Now what we're going to do is we're going to stop the supplementation, and we're going to follow up those older adults another 12 weeks after the end of the study, and we want to see whether the cognitive effects we hope to observe are still present at 36 weeks. Okay, because that's one of the really important questions we need to address is how long-lived those effects are. There's some nice evidence from a resistance exercise training study that used a year of basically lifting very small free weights in older adults over a year period. It looked then 2 years later at whether there was still any benefit, and there was still detectable cognitive benefits at 2 years. And actually, there was a slight improvement in grey matter in the brain in those participants as well at 2 years. So there's some anecdotal, sort of small amounts of evidence that some of these effects can be quite long-lived, but we don't know how long-lived they are yet. One of the other aspects also relates to this is looking at what aspects of the interventions are actually driving these benefits on cognition. So we heard briefly about the Mediterranean diet tonight. It's a nice snapshot of the Mediterranean diet. It looks very attractive, lots of good things in it, including, of course, the red wine, which most of us always find very appealing in the Mediterranean diet. There's some data that shows benefits of a Mediterranean diet at about 6.5 years on cognitive performance. But of course, one of the big questions about this is what is it in the Mediterranean diet that's actually driving those cognitive benefits? Is it something within this diet, or is it perhaps something that you're excluding? So, for example, is it the fact that you're not eating so much red meat? Is that what's important within that Mediterranean diet? And the same sort of issues could be applied to things like brain training as well, where what you're doing is you're taking a range of tests as part of that multi-component intervention. Now, maybe it's the holistic nature of the intervention that's really important, but it could be that there are particular components in that intervention that are driving the effects. If we know what they are, we can make our interventions more efficient for the general public. Another question that we need to look at is to what extent nutrition, exercise and brain training collectively help to build this notion of cognitive reserve. So this is the idea that some people's brains are more able to tolerate the sort of pathology that you see in Alzheimer's disease. So when you look inside people's brains, some people that age quite naturally don't show any particular cognitive decline will show these sorts of Alzheimer's type pathologies in their brain, but they seem to have a resistance to showing cognitive decline. So understanding what it is that builds up that sort of cognitive reserve is really, really important. And Jeremy in particular mentioned things like blood flow. So that's one potential mechanism by which this cognitive reserve might be building up. And it may be doing all sorts of things. It might be causing new neuron growth, or it might, for example, be leading to increases in grey matter in the brain. But something's happening in some of these individuals which makes them more resistant to tolerate aging. And finally, there's also the sort of the so what question. The question that we've been looking at tonight is all about sort of the effects of lifestyle interventions on delaying cognitive decline. And we've mentioned a whole bunch of different cognitive tests. Some of the names are acronym city, I must admit, but they do mean something to us as psychologists and as neuroscientists. But if we want to influence you, the general public, if we want to influence policymakers in terms of making changes, we have to move away from using just tests of memory and tests of executive function to start using tests that perhaps have more everyday validity. So I'm sure we could influence members of the general public much better if we could tell them, for example, that eating blueberries 3 times a week could influence their driving behaviour. So could it improve the ability to detect hazards on the road when you're driving as you age? That's the sort of measure which we need to start including in far more of our studies as a standard measure. Now, finally, I just want to mention one study in concluding, which is the Care-Philly studies. This is a study that's run out of Cardiff over the last sort of 40 years by Peter Elwood and his group. And the reason I want to just show you this study is for 2 reasons. The first reason is it shows what happens when you start to combine different lifestyle interventions over a really long period of time. So what this study started off with was in 1979, they had about 2,500 then middle-aged men And they asked them to follow 5 very simple rules. Eat well, work out, drink less, keep your weight down, and don't smoke. Okay? Simple rules to say. What they found was that only 5% of that group stuck to either 4 or 5 of those rules, okay, at the time in 1979. When they followed them up in 2014, these are of course much older adults by this point, what they found was that statistically those people were far fitter and they were far healthier. And when they looked statistically in terms of the likelihood of cognitive decline, they found that that group, that 5% group, had a 60% reduction in cognitive impairment compared to the rest of that cohort. So it certainly suggests that taking and adhering to those sorts of lifestyle interventions, of course we didn't have brain training in there at the time, but you might imagine brain training as well, confers a real benefit over a very long period of time. The second point I want to make is this one. What this study also did, right at the end, was they looked at the general population in Wales today, and they tried to estimate how many people would follow effectively these 5 rules. And what they found is that in 2014, so 40 years later, looking at the general population today, only about 5% of people followed 4 or 5 of the rules that they set out in 1979. So over a 40-year period, the adoption of those healthy behaviours hasn't changed a bit. And that's a really stark finding, I think. So I'm going to finish with this one thought. And this is a real wish list at the moment. We're not doing this right now, but this is a study that we would like to do. We'd like to do it in Berkshire, because Berkshire has a wonderfully varied population. It has an urban population, it has a rural population, it has a very affluent population, it also has a socially sort of deprived population as well. So what we'd like to do is a long-term study, a bit like the one in Caerphilly, but here in Berkshire. We'd like to take some of the latest evidence from diet, exercise and brain training. So some of the work that you've heard tonight, for example, we want to turn that into interventions that we give to members of the public across Berkshire. And then this is the key bit. What we want to do is we want to combine it with some of the latest state-of-the-art techniques for getting people not only to adopt these healthy behaviours, but to try and maintain them over time. That's the really key bit that we have to now do as researchers. Everyone knows this stuff's good for you, but it's actually getting people to adhere to those different lifestyle interventions that's becoming a really, really important piece of work. So we'd like to follow those over time and follow them potentially over decades, so perhaps over 2 or 3 decades. Okay, so that's the wish. All we need now is to get some funding to do it. The last challenge. So on that note, thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to leave you with this quote by George Burns, which I think is getting more apt than ever. So thank you very much.